Så, god kväll och välkomna till detta bokrelease-webinar för boken Brottsplats Golgata, eller Cold Case Christianity som den heter på engelska. Här ser ni den svenska översättningen som vi nyss har fått från tryckeriet här för drygt en vecka sedan. Jättekul att ni vill vara med oss ikväll och träffa författaren och prata lite om den här boken, och det kommer vi göra på engelska naturligtvis, så det är det språk ni kommer att få stå ut med att höra från och med nu. So, good evening, everyone. I'm Martin Helgesson. I work with Apologia, Center for Christian Apologetics. We want to help Christians and non-Christians alike explore all kinds of questions about the gospel of Jesus Christ. It could be philosophical questions, historical, ethical, theological questions, whatever the kinds of questions we believe that an honest question deserves an honest answer. And so we try to serve people in and outside Sweden through speaking at various kinds of events in churches or in public forums. We do offer online learning, so distance courses and that sort of thing, webinars. We publish books and podcasts and videos. And tonight we are delighted and honored to be in the company of the latest author that we get to introduce to Swedish readers, and that's J. Warner Wallace.
Well, thanks so much, Martin, for
There you
having
are.
me. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm just an honor to be
Welcome.
with you guys. So
Yeah,
glad to be
that's
with you guys.
thank you for joining us, Jim. Do you
Yeah,
want to
of
tell
course.
everyone where you're connecting from?
I'm in Southern California, which is on the west coast of United States, of course, and we're in
Yeah.
southern part of that state. And there's a city called Los Angeles, and this county is really large. It has a ton of law enforcement agencies that work in this county.
Uh-huh.
And I served in one of those agencies. So most of my experience came out of the kind of crimes you would expect to occur in a huge city
Mm.
like Los Angeles, which is pretty dense.
Yeah. So California is actually roughly the same size as Sweden, but there's about, I don't know, 8 times the amount of people or something. So,
Well, and a lot
um,
of it, of California, people think of California, and it's not all like Los Angeles County, which is pretty
mm,
densely populated. I mean, most of the
sure.
state is farmland,
Yeah.
and I mean, just like you could fly over. I mean, probably less than 10% of the state is actually populated the way you think of it. But
Yeah.
yeah, you're right. It's
Yeah.
a big state. That's
It's
right. Oh, this has
quite the
been a
week.
crazy 10 years. Well, that's part of like anybody who's listening to this who maybe feels like they're interested in making the case for Christianity, but wondering how in the field they're in they could ever really contribute. Well, that was me. I
Mm.
didn't think I would ever contribute in this field, and I didn't really start writing in earnest until I was, not doing investigations on a daily basis. Once that
Yeah.
became something that was intermittent, then I was able to write. And so I
Mm.
think that there's a season. And for me, that season has been in like really the last 10 years or so.
Mm. That's good to hear. And obviously, I'll hand over to you in a bit, and I'll have
Okay.
you introduce the book, and we'll have some questions about the book from the people who are joining us. But since I think I mean, some people have definitely heard of you here in Sweden and have read your book in English. And like I mentioned before, there's the kids version of Cold Case Christianity has been out in Swedish for, I guess, a couple of years now or so.
Yeah. Yeah, I
But
guess so.
but it would still be great to take a few minutes just to get to know you as a person a little more. And I know you notice right away when you read the book that you're a homicide detective with a degree in
Mhm.
art, which I imagine is a
Yeah.
bit of an unusual combination. How did you become a detective with that kind of background?
Well, my dad was a cop, and so I watched him for years, and
Uh-huh.
I tinkered with the idea growing up in high school, but I think I just followed my kind of giftedness,
Mm,
and that for us, for me at least, it was in the graphic arts and in the world of
mm,
art, and so I got a bachelor's degree in art, but then kind of wondered how we would, my wife and I kind of wondered how would we pay the bills with an art degree.
you don't
There's an
have to tell me. I'm
expression.
a philosophy major, so
Okay,
I
exactly. So you know what I'm talking about. So we
I
we thought,
do.
well, the kind of the grandfather of the arts is architecture. So I
Yeah.
got a master's degree in architecture, and I was serving as an architect, working as an architect in Southern California here in a city
Mm,
called Santa Monica. And I was there, and just kind of watching my dad from afar and thinking that's probably. I just thought that in some ways would have been a more stable way to raise the kind of family I wanted to raise.
Hmm.
So I put my feet in that world and became a police officer. And then, of course, if you serve long enough, and I was older when I started, so it wasn't long before I was working investigations, and then really made it my whole career working. Some of the cases my dad actually had worked before me, had investigated that were still open. I was
Really?
able to go back and close one of them, but not more than one. Which,
Hmm.
but that's kind of was the challenge. I didn't see how the art side of my life would ever be used in this side. But
Hmm.
it turns out that a lot of these cold cases are difficult to describe to juries.
Okay.
They're difficult to assemble, and if you can
Uh-huh.
assemble them visually, you can make progress. And I just
Right.
took that same approach really when I it was investigating Christianity, and even now as I speak about the Christian worldview, it's
Hmm.
highly visual because I think that's just an easier way. We're visual creatures, and it helps us to see it, to see the case.
Interesting. Huh. So, on the detective side, can you describe one or some of the traits that go into being a skilled homicide detective?
Well, I think there's certain kind of underlying kind of presuppositions or maybe skill sets you need. So you have to be the kind of person who is inquisitive.
Hmm.
And what I mean is, if that typically means you're probably somebody who's distrusting. So it's because if you trust
Interesting.
everybody, you're never going to inquire about what might be the lie.
Hmm.
If you don't trust anybody, then you're going to be inquisitive to figure out, well, should I trust them?
Yeah.
So I think that my own kind of skepticism about human nature was it helped me. I didn't become a Christian until I was on the job about 8 or 9 years.
Hmm.
But I was always skeptical and realized that no matter what you see, there's another side to our human nature that's almost always hidden. And if you're the kind of person who starts off with that presupposition that everyone in the room is a liar until I determine who's telling me the truth, you'll probably be a pretty good detective.
Really? Huh. That's fascinating.
So,
Um,
now
so,
that's not necessarily a good way to live, but it does
yeah,
it does help you to
sure.
kind of sort out because you're constantly trying to get to the truth of the matter.
Yeah.
Well, why when we use that expression, can you get to the truth of the matter? What we're really suggesting is that we're in a room full of lies,
Mm.
and somewhere is this hidden truth, and we need to get to it.
Mhm.
Okay, but if we assume the best in everybody, well, then you're a room full of truth tellers. How are you
Right.
going to get to the truth? Well,
Uh-huh.
you're already in it.
Yeah.
I'm assuming I'm not in it yet. So I
Yeah.
need to figure out what is true. And that requires an investigation. So that kind of attitude actually helped me.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. So the book is about how applying the skills you acquired as a detective or even this similar or the same criteria on the evidence of Christianity made you a Christian. But could you describe some of what were the very first steps in exploring whether Christianity is true?
Well, look, I don't think anything makes us a Christian except for the gospel. But
Mm.
I was the kind of person who didn't trust anybody who was speaking the gospel. I
Yeah.
assumed that even if there was some truth to any of this, the person who was speaking it would probably had an evil motivation, which isn't always true, right? But that was
Mhm.
my assumption. Just that's how I'm wired.
Yeah.
So for us, we I didn't have any Christians in my family growing up. Was not a church attender. My mom was kind of a cultural Catholic, was raised that way. I think she would have been, I mean, yeah, on Christmas and Easter for some number of years. But by the time I was maybe 10, there was no point in going to church to me. I didn't believe it.
Mm.
My mom divorced when I was about 3. She never remarried. And back in
Mm.
the 60s, if you were divorced, your status with the church, with the Catholic Church, even if you were just a
Sure.
cultural kind of like twice a year attendee, she
Mhm.
didn't even think she could go twice a year. So
Really?
we just didn't go.
Huh.
So which was fine with me because I thought it was all garbage to begin with.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
I was happy not to be involved with any of that. And I didn't have
Mm.
any friends that really were raised in the church. And when I met my wife, although I think she was always way more receptive and knew that God had to exist. But what is true about God, that was another issue. We never discussed it.
Mm.
That was not a criteria for us meeting each other. And we were actually together for 18 years before either one of us became a Christian.
Huh.
So that first part of our life was just not part of it.
Yeah.
And my skepticism also was not probably making it any easier. But
Sure.
Susie she thought, well, we have boys now. Should we raise our kids with a kind of more robust theological understanding? Like, well, I said I didn't think we needed to. I wasn't raised that way, and I saw no purpose. But I also will do anything that Susie wants to do. If she thinks this would be good for the boys, then I'm willing to go. My dad's that way, by the way. He's not a believer even
Mm.
today, but he's more than willing to go to church if he thinks
Mm.
it's good for me,
Right.
if he thinks I value it. He actually thinks it's a very useful delusion because it
Mm.
can help you to do positive things, including
Uh-huh.
raising your kids. So
Right.
he's more than happy to go. I was the same way. And so
Mm.
we walked into a church. I was 35, Susie was 33. And the pastor described Jesus in a way that I could selfishly want to pursue. He said that
Mm.
Jesus was super smart, that said some of the smartest things that ever been said. He made it sound like if he was nothing more than just an ancient, wise sage, that we should probably be interested in him.
Mm.
Well, okay, that's a level that I can entertain.
Uh-huh.
So I went out and bought a Bible to see what was so smart about Jesus.
No, you
And
never
what
know
I
what's going to
was
happen.
right, yeah, and what I was struck by, that most importantly was the accounts were varied.
Mm.
They don't seem to line up. On a
Mhm.
first read, you might have a lot of open questions about why does it say this in one gospel and seems to say something almost contrary in another gospel. Well, that's exactly what eyewitnesses do all
Mm.
the time. If it happened just 2 hours ago and you are the first person they've ever had a chance to talk about it with, they will say things that'll leave you scratching your head.
Yeah,
And we want to retain, we want that. I want if I get there and you've allowed these guys to talk to each other, these witnesses, well, they're going to end up telling me the same thing over and over and over again because they've already talked to each other, and I'm
of
not going to
course.
trust it. But
Mm.
when I get there and it seems like, yeah, if they had talked to each other, they wouldn't be saying it this differently. Well, there's truth in there. I just got to figure out like how to reconcile what appear to be differing statements, and they never
Mhm.
really are. Although the defense attorney loves to say they are, but they really aren't. And
Mm.
so I just knew that from my perspective, this had the texture of what I would expect if I had varying accounts.
Mm.
And so I wanted to deep dive those. And so that's what I did. And that most of that journey has been chronicled in either this book, Cold Case Christianity, or a book I wrote called Person of Interest,
Right.
which kind of gets the other piece of it in. But yeah, so a lot of it for me was I'm obsessive and skeptical. So I'm looking to see if there's a grain of truth here. And when I ended up doing was knocking down all the barriers that I had held for years against anyone who talked about the gospel. Look, I can tell you as a kid growing up, my wife used to laugh at me because we've known each other since high school. I used to watch a televangelist here. I don't know
Mhm.
what part of the country he was from originally, but they broadcast his half-hour televangelism show here in Southern California. And I would watch it every morning at 5:30. And she said, "Why are you watching this?" Because he was a masterful manipulator. That's why I watched
Oh,
it.
yeah.
I would watch him move from the message of whatever it was he was preaching into a request for money. And he
Right.
did it so seamlessly. Now, look, that was my view then
Hmm.
of all of these peddlers of the gospel.
Sure.
That was kind of the view I held all the way into walking into that church. So I just needed to overcome all of the stuff I had constructed in front of a clear understanding of the gospel so that I could hear it and it wouldn't be colored by my skepticism.
Mm.
So that's what I said about it. And I wasn't doing that intentionally. But not Lee Strobel's a good friend of mine, and he wrote the book called The Case for Christ.
Uh-huh.
Well, that's Lee was trying to disprove his wife Leslie. That was not me. I wasn't trying to. I mean, I was benign about it. If
Right.
Susie wants to go, I don't care if it's true or false. If she wants to go, we're going to go.
Hmm.
I just wanted to know, is there any truth in it? And I was provoked by the differences between the gospels.
Mm.
So that's how this whole thing started for me.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So,
Okay, I'm going to go ahead now and share this screen. So give me a
yes.
second here. And here it
Uh-huh.
comes. You should be seeing a slide that says, "Can
Yes.
I trust the Bible?" Okay,
Yes.
so we should be
Perfect.
good to go. I should be in the corner of this too, so we can still see each other a little bit.
Uh-huh.
All right, so I want to talk about just, can I trust the Bible? This is the first and foremost question I had. Could I trust this? Well, look, my background was such that I was the kind of person who was always involved in investigations, and I think I've done more publicized investigations that I was actually had hands-on than probably about anybody else in our country that ended up on major media. And that's because I had a chance to work as part of 3 generations of law enforcement. This is my son, Jimmy. He's been on the job about 13 years now. He has my name. He got that from me, of course, and because we're pretty self-obsessed, we use the same name over and over and over again. So I was the police officer there for years before him, and my dad, with the same name, was there before me. So we've been at this job, working and serving in this community for 63 years now. And really, a lot of my experience has been a collection of all those 63 years, not just my career in the middle, but a lot of the cases I worked were my dad's cases before. Now, when I go to trial, I'm constantly having to talk about, like, how do you build a case? Like, what counts as evidence? So let me just start by saying this. If someone says to you there's no hard evidence for Christianity, they're telling you the truth. And it's because there's no hard evidence for anything. Hard is not a category of evidence. We don't go to trial and we say, oh gosh, we've got some hard evidence to show you, and we've got some soft evidence to show you. That is not how this works. There's 2 categories of evidence, direct and indirect. That's it. Every case is made from those 2 categories. Indirect evidence is harder to explain. So let me just start by saying what direct evidence is. Direct evidence is simply eyewitness testimony. When someone sees something, they were there to capture it in their mind's eye. They can see it through their eyes, and now they have a memory of it, and they report that back to you. That's called direct evidence. Everything else is indirect. DNA, indirect. Fingerprints, indirect. If it's not an eyewitness saying, here's what I saw, it is in the second category, and there are only 2 categories. So let me show you what I mean by this. Let's say we have a man who's been accused of killing his girlfriend with this baseball bat. He bludgeoned her to death. If I've got a witness who's across the street, could say, I saw him do it. I saw everything. I know that guy. That I know him facially. I recognized him. Well, then this witness, if she holds up in court, can be used as the single piece of evidence that might convict this man. She saw him do it. This is called a direct evidence case because it's dependent upon an eyewitness. On the other hand, if he happened to have a mask on his head, let's say, so that she cannot identify who did it, but I go out and I talk to him, and he's, pardon me, he's lying about his alibi. We do a search warrant, and we recover property that matches maybe clothing that was seen. Although they couldn't identify him, they could see the clothing, or maybe there's no forced entry into the home. So he had to have a key, and he is one of the people who would have a key. Or maybe he makes a statement in which he says that, yes, this is his girlfriend, and he occasionally gets upset with her. And he's been known, and he feels bad about it, but he actually has smacked her on time. He's been physical with her. So he's given us like kind of a prior history of this turbulent relationship. And he happens to have a pair of boots that matches the boot print at the scene. And it's an unusual pair of boots, very rare. Very few copies of these boots are actually even worn by anyone in the county. And we know that he was even getting ready to commit suicide because he wrote a suicide note in which he's describing how he's feeling distraught over something he did yesterday, the day of the murder. And although he doesn't actually say what it is he did that was so horrific, and maybe he even drives an unusual car that was seen at the crime scene. Look, we're going to put this entire case. This is all, by the way, every piece of this case is what is using what we call indirect evidence. And when you have a case that involves 10, 100 pieces of indirect evidence rather than an eyewitness account, well, the question is it possible that he's innocent and he just looks guilty? Yes, of course it is possible. Absolutely. Why? Because anything is possible. The standard of proof in America, in California especially, is beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond a possible doubt. There is nothing I can prove to you beyond a possible doubt. You're watching a Zoom presentation and you have no idea if I'm who I say I am or if I'm just an AI version, an avatar for who you don't know. You can't, it's possible. Now, you don't think it's reasonable. You think it's reasonable that I'm who I say I am and that I'm coming to you from Los Angeles County, but it's possible I'm not. And that's why the standard of proof cannot be as high as beyond a possible doubt. It has to be a lower standard called beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's what we're after here. We're not after, is it possible? That we're after, is it reasonable? Now, because look, these pieces of evidence might be explained by 8 other unrelated causes. But it does seem like he is the one way to explain all of the evidence. He has a weapon that matches the weapon. For example, what if we found that he had taken that baseball bat, the one we find in a search warrant, and it turns out that he's bleached that baseball bat? Why would you bleach your baseball bat? Well, maybe he's done it because he's trying to remove biological evidence. You see what I'm saying? The more of these pieces you have, the stronger the case. Now, I wouldn't go to trial with 8 pieces of evidence necessarily. I might have 80 that point to him. And this kind of case is called an indirect evidence case. Now, here's the problem with it. Indirect evidence is also known commonly as circumstantial evidence here in America. And that term is almost like a pejorative. People look at that term as a negative. You know, oh, that's all you have is circumstantial evidence. But it turns out circumstantial evidence, and you'll see this, you'll see all the time in reports. It's purely circumstantial, as if to say it's not that good. Well, it turns out all of my cold cases, unsolved murders, are purely circumstantial. You know why? Because they're unsolved for a reason. There wasn't a witness 30 years ago to make the case clear. I have to build them without eyewitnesses. And we've never lost because these are powerful cases. Now, in the book Cold Case Christianity, I've kind of drawn it this way. And the idea here is that I call this death by 1,000 paper cuts because any one of these little pieces of evidence may not be all that compelling on its own. It's only because it's part of a much larger collection, all of which can be reasonably explained by this man's involvement in this murder. That's what makes the case powerful. Now, judges here in America actually instruct jurors to treat circumstantial evidence, indirect evidence, the exact same way they treat direct evidence. Neither is to have any greater value, any greater weight. Both direct and circumstantial evidence are acceptable, and neither is entitled to any greater weight than the other. So now I'm explaining this to you because this was the approach I was taking. I needed to build a cumulative, circumstantial case to determine if what the gospel authors were saying about Jesus was actually true. Now, I don't trust eyewitnesses, even though there are several accounts in the New Testament that are claim at least to have been written by eyewitnesses or from eyewitness testimony. Luke, for example, is not an eyewitness, but he claims to be talking to the eyewitnesses. Mark is writing, and I do believe there's good reason to believe, both historically and evidentially, that Mark is writing for the Apostle Peter. Matthew is writing for Matthew. John is writing for John. So what do we do with this? Well, we got to test it. I don't trust eyewitnesses. I test eyewitnesses because eyewitnesses lie all the time. And I've been caught with eyewitnesses that have lied. Well, I want to make sure that I can test them so I can go to trial and feel comfortable about them. Well, it turns out, in California at least, there is a jury instruction that we give jurors in criminal trials. And this instruction basically helps us to determine if witnesses are telling the truth. It's based on 4 broad principles. And here are the broad principles. So just to make it easier for those of you who might be taking notes on this, and this is what I'm talking about in Cold Case Christianity. Look, the first part of Cold Case is just 10 rules, 10 approaches, tools that detectives use to investigate cases. I want to, first of all, help you become a good detective. So now you can turn the corner and investigate the Gospels with me. But the second half of the book is really about these 4 principles applied to the Gospel authors. So to make it simpler, there are single words I use. Were they present? Were they really there to see what they said they saw? Can they be corroborated in some way? Have they been accurate and honest over time, or have they embellished their story? And finally, do they have a reason to lie to me? So this was the approach I took, not just with criminal cases, but this is the approach I took with the gospel authors. I needed to know if I tested the gospels under these 4 criteria, would they pass the test? Tonight with you guys, I'm just going to do 2 of these 4 because it's just impossible in this time frame to do anything else. So let's just get right at it. We're going to test the gospel authors with these criteria. We're going to start with the first one. Were they present? Now, this is a case here in this newspaper clipping from 1972 or 1974 about a case that was investigated that occurred. The murder occurred in 1972. My dad is the guy on the right of this clipping. He's walking over the man in the center. That guy in the center confessed to the murder. The murder was a kind of gruesome murder of a 10-year-old girl in our city. And to be honest, we knew my dad was suspicious of this guy from the very beginning. He's not the killer. We did solve this case in 2019. So that's a lot of years after 1972. But we solved it on the basis nearly how many years is that? Later, 50 years later. We solved it basically on the basis of DNA evidence. But I wanted to let you know that you can't be a killer if you weren't even there. And in a similar way, you can't be an eyewitness if you weren't even there. And that was my suspicion about the Gospels. Let me give you a timeline. Here's this ministry of Jesus in the first century. Here is where the early Christians came together and said, okay, the New Testament canon is going to include these 4 Gospels. This is called the Council of Laodicea. My suspicion was that if the Gospels are written late in history, although they might contain some truth about Jesus, we need to stop thinking of them as eyewitness accounts because they're disqualified immediately because they were written well after the life of eyewitnesses. As a matter of fact, if you wanted to lie about Jesus, here's what you do. You wait till everyone who knows the truth is dead. Then you can say anything you want about Jesus. It's hard to lie about Jesus in the same lifetime of people who would know the truth. That's why it's important to know when are they written. Now, there are a lot of skeptics, like Bart Ehrman, for example, who's written his own share of skeptical books, who don't believe they're written early enough to be eyewitness accounts. My question is, how close is the writing to the actual event? If it's over here on the timeline, well, then we can at least start to look at this, take these seriously. Because they were written, they can still be a lie, by the way. They can still be telling a lie, but it is a lot harder to tell the lie if you're telling the lie early. And that's why I needed to know how early is the lie. Now, I was not convinced it was true. I just needed to know, does it pass the first test? So I started to look at this using a circumstantial case. Here's how I did it. There's a book in the New Testament called the Book of Acts. It's written by the Apostle Luke, and he's describing everything that the disciples of Jesus did after Jesus ascended into heaven. It records a really kind of neat snapshot picture of the Jewish world around Jerusalem and well beyond in the first century. And in that book, the Book of Acts, nowhere does Luke describe the destruction of the temple or even the siege of Jerusalem. Now, you would think that he would probably describe these for a couple of reasons. One, so much of the activity in the Book of Acts surrounds Jerusalem. And two, Luke says that Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple. Wouldn't you want to tell your readers that the prediction actually came true? I think it'd be a big deal, yet it's missing from the Book of Acts. In addition, Paul is still alive at the end of the Book of Acts. Now, that's interesting because Luke mentions deaths. Why not mention the death of Paul? By the way, his beloved partner, and they're good, close friends. The beloved doctor, Luke does not mention the death of Paul. He mentions the death of James, the brother of John, just a common disciple. Yet he doesn't mention the death of Paul, his best friend, or the death of Peter, the disciple that has been given and trusted this leadership role. No. Does he mention the death of James, the brother of Jesus, who led the church in Jerusalem? Yet he mentions the death of James, the brother of John. Why are these 3 most important characters in the entire book of Acts? Why is their death missing from the pages of the book of Acts? Well, one of the reasons why these 4 or 5 things here might be missing is because, let me go back here. These 4 or 5 things might be missing because they haven't happened yet. That seems to me to be a reasonable inference. So let me just tentatively postulate a writing of the book of Acts prior to 61 AD, prior to the first missing event, which is the death of James, the brother of Jesus. By the way, Barnabas's death is not mentioned either, and that's about the same time. So I think this is a reasonable inference. It's written before these major characters in the book of Acts were martyred. Now, remember that Luke writes his gospel first. So that means I've got to date Luke's gospel earlier than 60. And we know he writes it first because he tells us this on the pages of the book of Acts. He says that in his former book, he wrote about everything that Jesus did. Now, remember, Luke is not a witness of the life of Jesus. He knew the people after Jesus ascended. He knew Paul. He knew everyone that Paul knew. He came on the scene late. He only learned about Jesus from those who were eyewitnesses. So he's a witness in the book of Acts, but just a reporter of witnesses. Now, why does that still matter? Because it turns out every report I investigate, every case I investigate, is filled with supplemental reports of eyewitness accounts. They are not written by the eyewitness. They are written by detectives who are interviewing the eyewitness. Are they still eyewitness accounts? Of course. So it turns out that if I've got a reporter who's writing about the eyewitness account, today in a criminal case, we still consider that to be an eyewitness account. So the same way it happens here. Luke is writing about this as an eyewitness later, but talking to the people who were eyewitnesses of Jesus. Now let's just cut to some hidden evidence that you might not have seen in Scripture. And here's one of them. I want you, again, keep in mind the dating timeline I've already offered here. Paul writes a letter to his protege, Timothy, 1 Timothy in chapter 5. And this is in the 60s. And he says to Timothy that you should take care of people who serve in the church, Timothy, because my Bible tells me so. He says in the 4th line here that Scripture says this. Now, he could have said, we know this because God has revealed this to us. No, he says it's Scripture that says this. In other words, there's writing out there that contains the following 2 verses. And the first one is, do not muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain. That's from Deuteronomy. The second verse is not from the Old Testament at all. The second verse is from the Gospel of Luke, which means that Luke's gospel has to be out there, available to Paul to quote to Timothy as early as the early part of the 60s. And it has to be considered Scripture on par with the writings of Moses. It must have been around for a little bit. It must be considered authoritative. Now, it turns out that we know that he writes another letter to the Corinthian church, Paul, in which he quotes an even larger piece of Luke's gospel when telling them how to do the Lord's Supper. So it appears that Paul is comfortable, and this, by the way, is in the 50s. And this is considered, Luke's gospel, apparently, is considered authoritative, is considered to be Scripture, and the kind of Scripture you can use to make spiritual decisions and make cases for the truth of Christianity and theism in general. And it's considered authoritative by the 50s. And he's using it this way with congregations that he had planted earlier and apparently had used it back when he planted the church, because he's reminding them of what he taught them earlier in this passage. So I think that the idea that Luke's gospel would be available as early as I have it in this timeline seems to be supported by internal evidence from the New Testament. Now, let's go to the first line of Luke's gospel. He tells you that he's not an eyewitness. He's just carefully talking to those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. And he says, therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Well, for detectives, here's what I typically try to do. And let me just stop sharing for a second here and come back on screen with you for a minute. I always tell people that you have to pay attention to every little word. There's a chapter in the book about this. And words are optional. Not everyone uses the same words. And you make choices about the words that are optional. And they're almost always adjectives and adverbs. Adjectives and adverbs never need to be used. And we only use them because it's going to show something about us, and sometimes something we don't want people to see. We can give away certain things by the kinds of optional words we use, adjectives and adverbs. So, for example, if I said to you that this is my black clicker, okay, remote control, I've told you something. And I've told you more than you might think I told you, because you have to consider the optional words. The optional word in this case, this is my black clicker, is the word black. It's an adjective. I didn't need to use it. I could have just said, this is my clicker. You can see it's black. So the fact that I didn't need to use that word because you could see it, yet I still did, tells you something about. It tells you that I probably have more than one clicker. And my other clicker is not this color. This is my black clicker. Now, you could stop at just, this is my black clicker, or you can dig deeper, because now I know I need to start looking for the second clicker, because there's more than one. And I'm talking to a suspect. I'm often looking for those kinds of clues. Optional words matter. Let me go back now to share this screen with you real quick. Okay. Here we go. So let's go back now and just talk about this verse here, which let's see if I can get it. There we go. So this is the verse we're talking about. And here are the optional words in the second sentence in this verse. The first one here is carefully. It is a adverb. Why would I have to say this? He could have just said, I've investigated everything from the beginning, Theophilus. I got it right here for you. Nope. He says, I've carefully investigated it. Why? Why? Why is he saying that? Because there's another clicker out there that's a different color. There's another gospel out there that's not as careful. There's another early gospel. If you compare Mark, for example, to Luke, you will find that Mark is much briefer. Luke expands everything out, talking to more than just what Peter says about Jesus in Mark. It contains what everyone says to me about Jesus. So it's more careful. You'll see a second optional word here, most excellent. This is a word that is typically used for people who are in positions of leadership in your city. I don't know who Theophilus was. I have some ideas. I talk about that in the book, but we know one thing: he's somebody important, just from the optional word. And here we have another word that you'll see in the optional word. It's the word orderly. Do you see it there in the next to last line? He's written in orderly. This means in the Greek, it's in the correct chronological order. Why in the world would you write what appears to be a history of Jesus, starting with his birth and ending with his death and resurrection? It appears to be in the right order, but you're going to tell me it's in the right order? Why do you need to tell me that? If you're writing a history, like a biography of Jesus, don't I assume it's in the right order? Well, it turns out if there's another clicker, it's a different color, and there's another early gospel that's out there that's earlier than Luke's that is not in the right order, and it's called the Gospel of Mark again. And if you compare Mark to Luke, you'll see there are some variations in the ordering of events. And Papias, an early church leader, said centuries ago, millennia ago, that Mark's gospel was written in Rome at the feet of Peter while he's teaching, and it is accurate if not orderly, he says. And the word for orderly is the exact same Greek word you see here. So we knew from the very beginning that Mark's gospel was not in the right order, and Luke is saying, I've got his stuff in here now. And who does he quote more than anyone else? He quotes Mark, which means he's got to have access to Mark. And that's why I put Mark's gospel earlier. So when we're doing timelines for criminal cases, we're trying to figure out, is the bad guy available to do the murder? Here, what we're doing is we're saying, is the bad guy available to is the writer of the gospel available to write the gospel as an eyewitness? Or did he have access to the eyewitnesses? Or is it written so late in history that neither of those are available? That's what I needed to know. And I think it passes the first test. Does not mean it's true. Just means it passes the first test. Now, I'm going to skip the second test and the fourth test and give you number 1 and 2. And the book contains all of them, of course, in their detail. But I'm going to go to this third piece, which is accuracy over time. And if you've got a case, for example, where I've got cases where someone kills his wife and then he buries her body and then he claims that she just ran off, and then 30 years go by and we have no evidence. They never even worked it as a murder. It was worked as a missing persons report. And so how do I make a case like this? Well, I trace his statements. Has he changed his statements over the years? My suspicion of the Gospels was that the statement had been changed over the years, even if it was early. I didn't trust that what the early version of Jesus, as just a simple preaching rabbi who never worked any miracles, was not born of a virgin, never rose from the grave. That got exaggerated over the years until we now have a miracle working, virgin born, resurrected Jesus. The real Jesus was much simpler, in my view, just a preaching rabbi in the first century. That's the Jesus of history. The Christ of Christianity is just the legend that changed over time. Well, something similar happens in criminal cases. So let's say we have a crime scene, and then 30 years later, we go to trial, and I bring into trial a casing, a bullet casing that was found at the crime scene, and I bring it into the trial. And I tell the jury that that bullet casing has an extractor pin mark on it that matches the extractor pin of the defendant's handgun. So that's why it's important evidence. It basically ties this casing found at the crime scene to the murderer, who is the defendant in this case, because he owns that gun. Well, the question I think is reasonable to ask is, how do I know that somebody didn't take that casing from 30 years ago and 15 years later pull it out of property and etch in carefully what appears to be an extractor pin mark, but it's actually not. It's just the etching of this lying detective. He then carefully puts it back in property so nobody is wiser about it. Years later, it's taken out and examined. I bring it into court, and I have no idea. I've got basically a bad piece of evidence in the trial because it's tampered. It's a tampered piece of evidence. Couldn't something similar happen down here on the bottom? I've got some gospel version of Jesus, but how do I know it's the same version that comes to trial? How do I know it wasn't changed in the middle? Hundreds of times, over 330 years worth of changes until finally, whoever Jesus was, the version I have today is completely different in the same way that the shell casing has been tampered. So has the story of Jesus. And that was my suspicion, that even if it was early, it wasn't accurate because the legend had grown. And Bart Ehrman actually wrote a book about this called How Jesus Became God. So skeptics still make this kind of claim. Now, how do I test something in a criminal trial? Let's go to the top line here for a second. I asked the question, well, who collected it? That guy who collected it, did he write a report or take a Polaroid picture back in the day? Something that we could have instantly so we can see what that little extractor part pin mark looked like. And then he gave it to somebody. Did that guy write a report in which he describes what he received from the first officer and takes his own picture? And then he brings it to the crime lab and they take more pictures and write more reports. And then I come pick it up years later, take another picture and take more reports. So now I have report after report after report, image after image after image over the years, connecting the past to the present like links in a chain. We call this in criminal trials the chain of custody. Is there a New Testament chain of custody that I could look and see? Is the casing changing? Because by the way, if that casing was tampered with by the third or fourth guy in the chain of custody, I'll see the tampering. I'll see that the image has changed. Is something like that available for us with the chain of custody in the New Testament? Yes, there is. Let's take a look. This is our kind of a timeline again from our crime scene, which is the ministry of Jesus, to the courtroom, which we'll call the church council at Laodicea. And the first question is, who is the first officer at the crime scene? Well, we'll just pick somebody for the sake of this examination, this first one, although there's many you could choose from. We'll just take John, for example. He sees something and he writes something, but how do I know that what I have in John's gospel today hasn't been changed over time? Well, I could ask the question, who did he give it to? It turned out that John had three personal students, Ignatius, Papias, and Polycarp. So the next link in the chain of custody, if I didn't have John's image of Jesus, I could ask these three guys, what did John tell you about Jesus? And if the story's been changing over time, I should find out that Ignatius, Papias, and Polycarp, they have a version of Jesus that's much more primitive. No virgin birth, no rising from the grave, no miracles, all the supernatural stuff. That clearly had to be added later because it turns out Ignatius, Papias, and Polycarp never heard of such a thing from John. But it turns out if you read their writings, and these guys became leaders in the local church and left us writings that we can use to see if the story is what John says the story is. So I can compare the writing of Ignatius to John. I can compare the writing of Ignatius to Polycarp. So, because I have the writings of Ignatius and Polycarp, and I can compare them to one another. Now, two of these guys had their own student named Irenaeus. Papias and Polycarp, Polycarp and Ignatius had a student named Irenaeus. So, if I wanted to see what Ignatius and Polycarp were teaching, I could simply look at the writing of Irenaeus. And sure enough, you'll see if the story is changing. Now, he had a student. This guy's student was named Hippolytus. So I can see by looking at Hippolytus's writing if the story is evolving. Now I've got the Jesus story over what, 4 generations, and I can see if the story is changing generation to generation. I can do the same thing, by the way, with the Apostle Paul. Here is his timeline through to Tatian. I'm just following student to teacher. Here's Peter through Mark and all the way into the council through Eusebius. And I can read those writings and ask the question, is the story more robust as time goes by? Well, it turns out if you didn't have any of the gospel authors, the eyewitnesses, and I consider Paul an eyewitness at least of the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, but if you didn't have any of that, but you had their students, you would find out that Jesus is the same miraculous God who rose from the grave, worked miracles, was born of a virgin. Like, you're stuck with this guy. You could say it's a lie. I get that. But you can't say it's an exaggeration because the story never changes. And I'm very confident of that because I've tracked the story over all those generations. So this is how we test eyewitnesses. And I'm not going to be able to go any further than this with this presentation today. But that's why we write books, right? Here's what we did. We started with this idea that you build a case cumulatively on the basis of indirect evidence. And I knew that if I was going to build the case for the historical Jesus, who is he really? Did he really rise from the grave? I was going to have to build it cumulatively on 4 legs, the same 4 legs that we use to test any eyewitness. The first is, was it written early enough? Yes, that's a reasonable inference given the evidence. We didn't talk about anything in this category, but that's why we write books. And we did talk about this. Did it change over time? No, it hasn't changed over time. I can tell you that with certainty. And we didn't talk about any of this, but you'll see it in the book. There's only 3 reasons why anyone lies, and they happen to be absent for the writers of the Gospels. So this is how I built the case cumulatively. And this is why I don't typically answer, why are you a Christian, online, because it's a much larger conversation and it's going to take a lot more time, because I think that things that matter, you should take time to determine if they're true. But that's how I built my case, so I could now hear, okay, so what is the gospel? Now I was ready to hear it. I'm not a Christian today, I will tell you, because it works for me. I know a lot of people who are. Fine. They don't have no idea what the evidence says. They have no idea if this is evidentially confirmable. They don't know. They were maybe raised in the church, or you know what? When they got sober because they put their faith in Christ, and God works that way, no doubt about it. They happen to be in the right place, even though they don't know why they're in the right place. But I needed to know first, is this true, before I could ever bite it? And I'm a Christian today because I'm stuck with it. It's true. It's evidentially true. And I don't have a way around it. And by the way, there's lots of days where it feels tough to be a Christian in America. I'm sure you feel the same way. And it's getting harder and harder, believe it or not, even in America. But I would much rather be in an inconvenient truth than in a convenient lie. So that's why I'm now a Christian. And that's basically the entire most of the journey. And again, most of it, you could find more detail, of course, as you read Cold Case Christianity. But I want to give you at least a peek at some of my thinking, and also kind of show you too, this is the kind of a visual approach. The book is fully illustrated. And I illustrate those books because I feel like it's easier for you then to see the case visually, if you see it visually, than to just to hear it just as spoken words or as written words. So I hope that that combination of images and and illustrations and words together are more compelling, help you to make the case, especially if you've got youngsters, because I think that's really kind of where we are right now, is we're going to have to make this case to young people.
All right. Thank you so much, Jim. That was a lot in a short period of time. So thank you.
Yep, for sure.
I know we talked about before backstage that you've done a lot of these over the years, presenting the this book, and yeah, that was pretty clear. Watching how much you could squeeze into this short amount of time.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
thank you. I think
exactly.
for a lot of people it was a bit of a fire hydrant to drink from,
Yes, no,
which
I
is
always
which
say,
is
yeah, I
fine.
always say that too, Martin. You're absolutely right, Martin. It's a lot of, but here's what I would say. Every one of us who's watching this right now, if you were raised in the church or came to the church later, or you're not in the church at all, and you're just kind of wondering if any of this is true, there is already something that you are so geeked out about, that you are so animated, so interested, that you are willing to spend hours giving your mind and heart to it.
Mhm.
And then you'll know this thing, whatever this hobby is. If it's a series, I mean, I remember when I was much younger, we would watch, series on Netflix or on any of these streaming platforms that were serial, like there's going to be 80 episodes of this. Okay. Are we saying right now that we're so interested in this series that we're willing to give it 80 hours? I guess we are, because now we're
Mhm.
36 hours in and we're hooked.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, at some point I had to realize, okay, I was interested in this. And I always tell people that young people can handle this. Yep, turn on the fire hose. Turn on the fire hose, just let it go. Because it turns
Yeah.
out that if something is really true, there
Mhm.
should be a fire hose worth of information about it.
Mhm.
right? Because this is a claim that is so ancient that you could plumb this claim for the rest of your life. You could be studying it. So
Yeah, yeah, that's great. And we have some questions coming in, so we'll
okay,
spend
good,
a few minutes looking at some questions.
great.
Encourage everyone, don't feel intimidated about asking if it was something that went by too quickly. You want to, go back to it and have it repeated a little bit. That's fine. You can type your question in Swedish if you prefer, and I'll translate it as I feed it to Jim. So just don't be afraid to ask any question. Worst thing that can happen is I don't forward it. But
Yeah.
get your questions in. And Tobias asks, what do you think about the oral tradition? I suppose it is possible that there's
Mhm.
memorized material that Paul and others quote and that Luke writes down later. Does that matter, or does it matter?
Yes, I do think the oral tradition is, we don't talk about it enough. This was an oral culture. In other words, um, I think if you look back, there's a good case to be made that Mark is the first gospel, although Matthew is the first gospel in the New Testament in your book. In your printing of the New Testament, I'm sure Matthew is going to come first. Okay. It turns out that I think there's very good reason to believe that Mark is the first gospel account, and it is written by Mark, the protege of Peter. It's Peter's account, and I've written about that in this book, but I'm actually doing a much deeper dive on that right now for the next book. And I think there's really good reason to believe this is Peter's account written in Rome and chronicled by Mark, who is telling it in a specific way for a specific purpose. And here's what I know: it's very short, so short that it can be read in its entirety in about an hour and 10, hour and 15 minutes. And that's how I believe it was first presented, because it was an account that, remember, not everyone's going to walk home then with their own Bible. They're
Mhm.
only going to hear the gospel orally at probably one time, maybe. And they're not going to have a written version of it they can take home with them. So it turns out it is written. The oral tradition is very strong. Now, you might say, well, yeah, but how good is the oral tradition at maintaining facts over time? Well, here's what I will say to you. If you were to listen to that presentation I just gave you and go back and listen to the same presentation from me on the same material 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you would see that it's not just similar, sadly. Even when it seems like it's spontaneous in the moment, it is word for word the exact same. You could take a transcript of my presentation 15 years ago and follow along with me as I'm presenting it to you today. If I'm somebody who's presenting it over and over again, maybe once a week for 15 years, it's pretty much word for word the same presentation. Now, imagine if I felt so compelled about something I'd seen that I'm not just going to share it once a week. I'm going to share it every day for the entire remainder of my life in the first century. Trust me, it will end up being a word for word. You can transcribe it at any point in that 15, 20 years period of time, and it'll be pretty much the same. Why? Because this is, I mean, you know this, I know this as a public speaker, and I'm not speaking my presentation of this nearly as often as the Great Commission led apostles and disciples were doing it in the first century. So I think that the oral ability to transmit material over a long period of time is much stronger than you've given really, but maybe even thought about. I think what you see in the gospel accounts is that if I knew that one of these disciples was considered to be foundational, primary, and he's got a version of the Jesus story out there, and I have some additional details I want to add, would it surprise you that I would honor the leading disciple by including his material first and then just adding, supplementing what Peter says about Jesus with what I also know to be true about Jesus? Would it say, by the way, if it was a nobody who had written that first account, you probably wouldn't see that kind of honor given to that first account. But instead, because it's Peter, you see Mark replicated at the highest levels in both Matthew and in Luke. Although they're going to add all kinds of other eyewitness testimony, in addition to that, they are first going to honor the big guy. His is going to come in, and you're just going to see it's going to be the big guy's statement, and then the other two gospels are going to be the big guy plus stuff, plus other stuff. And
Yeah.
and I don't think that doesn't, to me, that's what I would expect. And by the way, this makes sense even when you know that you would talk to more than one eyewitness. If one of them it feels like the others, they feel like he's the guy, they will be hesitant to say anything that might even contradict the guy. So you have to really kind of ask them, and you do see things in the other two accounts that you kind of scratch your head at. How can Mark be true and this same thing in Matthew be true? Well, it's because you're getting different inflections of the same account. But here's what you've got: you've got an oral tradition. So people will sometimes say there's a Q document, like
Mhm.
it's Mark and Q. Well, I think there is a Q set of facts, but it's not a written document. And then we've got no evidence that there's another written document out there early in Christian history. But we do have good evidence that there's a ton of oral traditions of people who had seen the risen Christ, had been part of the 70 perhaps that were dispatched to do miracles and to serve and to preach the gospel. I don't know who all these people were, but they certainly had another perspective about Jesus. And much of that has probably been captured by Luke, who is talking to the servants and eyewitnesses of the word. And that's that oral tradition that parallels Mark that ends up in Matthew and in Luke. So I think you see that yes, there is an oral tradition. It has the ability to maintain fact much better than you think it does. And it's represented in Matthew and Luke alongside the claims of Peter in the Gospel of Mark.
Okay, great, excellent. And so another Tobias, who's actually joining us from Finland, he asks, how do we know when Peter and Paul died? You had rough dates on your timeline there.
Yeah, so look, we have a great book on this. Is called The Fate of the Apostles by Sean McDowell. He did it as his PhD dissertation. And Sean and I were talking a lot during this time, and we loved the idea of rating the martyrdom accounts of the 12 because I think they're very, very wide ranging. Like you can have much more certainty about the death of Paul and Peter in Rome, historically, based on the historical documents of the early church, than you can, for example, about Thomas
Hmm.
and how he died, or Philip and how he died. So what Sean does is he's brutally honest about the spectrum of the disciples' deaths. The death of Paul, Peter, and James are the by far best attested historical deaths. And so they are by far the best. And
Hmm.
you can see exactly what that's based on in Sean's book. But here's what I would say. What's interesting to me, and I thought this too, is that you see an early church tradition of skeptics and government officials who are trying uh, to kill the Christian movement and are looking for people, looking to turn people, looking to get people to say, I will no longer worship this Jesus guy. I'm going to bow to the Roman gods. And you'll see them, sometimes it's exquisitely painful how they get them to do this, but it's an early church tradition. Here's what you don't have anywhere in any manuscript history of the first century, any manuscript that says that the disciples died in any way other than martyrdom. You would think in a culture in which you see other one generation from now, from one generation from the disciples, you will see early Roman documents of people saying, "I got this guy to flip." And he's not an eyewitness. He's just somebody who learned from an eyewitness. And what you don't have, though, is any document in which a Roman authority could say, "I got the eyewitness to flip."
Hmm.
And to me, the lack of opposing narratives when in fact it was in the interest of Rome to provide opposing narratives, and they did so early in history, is at least another piece of evidence in the overall case.
Great, thanks. I think I'll go to this one now. It's an anonymous question. Are there any parts in the Bible you have found to be contradictory? What about famous contradictions posed by Bart Ehrman? Is there any truth to any of them?
Well, okay, so part of the problem is, and I see even Christian scholars who will sometimes say, well, look, there's maybe some other way to explain this contradiction. Um, but they've never worked with eyewitnesses. And one of the few things I think I can bring to this, I'm not a historian. I'm not a biblical scholar. I'm not a manuscript evidence. I mean, I don't know. I can't speak to you about the original Greek and Hebrew in the New and Old Testament. Here's what I do. I talk to thousands of eyewitnesses. And if you saw what I start with, you would say these people are lying. Someone's got to be lying or just be flat wrong. Someone's just flat wrong about this. There's no way these two accounts that seem so contradictory could ever somehow be harmonized. But if you give me a few hours, now here's where I have an advantage. I can go back and re-interview the eyewitness. And without giving away what the other one said, I can say, hey, what did you mean when you said that? And then as he explains it out for me. But if all I had were the first two supplemental reports, so I don't believe that there are any contradictions. I believe that there are variations in the account. They can be harmonized. Now, you might say, well, how can that be? Well, so for example, there's a sign over the cross of Jesus, and all four gospels describe this sign. None of them agree.
Mm-hmm.
If you look, I mean, literally,
Yeah.
it's like you couldn't even get two of them to agree. You would think, right? Just two would agree. No, no. All four, all slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
That tells me that there's a version of that cross that is somehow the sum total of those four eyewitness accounts. Now, you might say, well, yeah, but this is different. This is the inspired word of God. Well, if what God wanted us to have is a set of four eyewitness accounts, okay, that can be examined as true eyewitness accounts that contain all of the attributes of true eyewitness accounts, he did a great job because he preserved for us four eyewitness accounts that have not been sterilized. And by the way, you don't think that could have happened in the first century? You don't think that by the time John's gospel is written, somebody could have said, let's just go back and change the other ones so they all match. And you would see that there are some more ancient ones that have these discrepancies and
Mm-hmm.
some later ones that didn't. No, it turns out they've been preserved with all their warts and pimples and scars. They've been preserved pretty faithfully all of those years because it turns out this is exactly what eyewitnesses do. I can tell you that if I didn't find these kinds of apparent contradictions that are just the expected variations you have between eyewitnesses, I would have still been skeptical. It's the presence of the variations that gave me confidence that, yeah, this looks like if you're just preserving, and by the way, when I first started, I didn't give a lick about whatever the Christian tradition for inerrancy is. I don't care about inerrancy. I need to know, is this a reliable eyewitness account? Did
Yeah.
the resurrection occur? That's all I need to know. This idea of inerrancy was foreign to me because I wasn't raised in the church. Don't care. Now, I get why this is important. Okay. But if what God is trying to do is to preserve something that we could test with our faculties and would recognize it as a true eyewitness account of the resurrection, he did it.
Thanks. Do you have time for one or two more?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Two more?
Sure.
All right, great. Stefan asks, do you use your profession to look into denominational doctrinal differences?
Yeah, I don't, and I'll tell you why. I think that there are things in your evidence set in a criminal case that you can say with certainty to a jury because you've got strong evidence that, okay, I
Mhm.
know this happened. Now, how did he get the body from here to there? I don't have I have some evidence. But to be honest, amongst our detective group, there's a variation that we disagree exactly about how he moved the body. I've got a theory, he's got a theory, he's got a theory. We don't all agree on the theory. Here's what we do know. He killed her. We all agree on that. But how did he move the body after? I don't know. That we're open to disagree about this secondary issue as long as we agree on the first issue, then we're going to go to trial. And what we're going to do in front of the jury is make a case for the first issue, but not the secondary issue. Because we don't what's the point in if Christians if the jury thinks that we are wrong about the secondary issue, and we might be because we don't have enough evidence, then they're gonna might think we're wrong about the primary issue. So we're not even gonna like argue that. We're gonna say it the way it is. Hey, he might have done this, he might have done that. We don't know. There's not enough evidence for this, but we do know this: he killed her. So what we do is we simply make a case for the primary issue and we leave the secondary issues off the table. And same way here for me. So for me, I don't know if I find that there's an issue, and there's tons of these, where there seems to be a strong biblical case for position A and a strong biblical case for position Z, and I've got people using scripture on both sides to argue this case. I typically think that's something where, by the way, once the defendant tells us how he moved the body, we will know, and then we're going to discover that some of us are wrong. Or maybe all of us are wrong.
Mhm.
So once God tells us how to sort that out because the evidence wasn't quite clear, we're going to find out that probably both of us are wrong. and there's
Mm.
some other reality because the mind of God is so much bigger. So I have a tendency to have some evidential modesty about the things that aren't clear evidentially. I don't make a big deal out of those. And
Mm.
now I get it. The problem, of course, is that for most of us who hold denominational differences, we think that that secondary issue is not actually a secondary issue. Everyone I've ever met who's making like the secondary issue is their mountain to die on,
Mhm.
is because they don't think it's a secondary issue. And then what do
Mhm.
you do with that? So I think what typically people who see me on these issues, these secondary issues, are not happy with me because I'm not going to side with one or the other. If you think you're right, good. And you can make a good, strong case from scripture, got it.
Mhm.
If you can
Mhm.
make an equally strong case, which you think is an equally strong case from scripture, I might disagree with you, but I also sense that this is not one of those things. If God wants it to be clear, it's evidentially clear in scripture. If God is not meaning for it to be clear, it's probably not as clear in scripture. And I'm willing to hold those with a more open hand.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks. So I saved this one for last, a question from Marcus, and I saved it for last because we're really hoping with the Swedish translation available now that it wouldn't just be something for Christians to read. We're hoping it will find its way into a lot of non-Christians' hands and maybe under
Sure.
their Christmas trees even in the next couple of weeks or so. But so Marcus asks, what do you recommend that you start? Where do you start when you're evangelizing? What's a good thing for a skeptic to look at? And so, with the ambition and hope that this book can be used by God to, reach people who are still skeptical or but maybe also open. Is there anything beyond, providing us with this book that you would say out of your experience? Where do you
Well,
advise people to
I'll say a
start?
couple of things.
Yeah.
Aaron Wrenn wrote an article in First Things. It's a blog
Hmm.
online, First Things, and he talks about the kind of world we are in America, different than maybe where you, but you're probably just 25 years ahead of us. That's all it is. It's probably the same world, but you're already in this phase that he is now seeing us entering in America. And he
Hmm.
talks about a positive world, a neutral world, and a negative world, and how our approach needs to be different based on what. So in the positive world, which is now long gone for us in America, it would have been seen as a positive, your Christian affiliation. You wouldn't have got elected to any national office unless you could express your Christian affiliation in some way. You had to be a church member somewhere. And it was
Hmm.
typically seen that church membership created moral people. A neutral world is a world in which it kind of evolved into, in which there's a number of possible spiritual worldviews, and all of them are seen as kind of equally wrong or equally true. Really not. You have to kind of, and you navigate those two worlds differently. In our country, there was a seeker-sensitive movement in the positive world, and that was because people were seeking something like something good. This is seen as a net positive, so why not try it out? And seekers were part of the formula. In a neutral world, you had people like Tim Keller, who were basically arguing for the rightness of this worldview over another, what's considered to be a neutral worldview. It's a neutral world. Anything is up for debate. But in a negative world, it's very different. And the question then becomes, what kind of leader will emerge in a world that sees Christianity as a net negative, opposing every social construct of the culture? It's the source of all bad things. It's the source of racism, misogyny, homophobia, genderphobia, whatever it is you can think of that the culture says we now approve. You Christians, it won't come along. And so it's a net negative. Now, what do you do in that kind of world? I think the first thing we do is we see that the largest mission field we have is our own children, because so many of us who call ourselves Christ followers will raise up young people who won't be. Now, Cold Case Christianity is a book that's really about, is it true?
Hmm.
And but my work in the last 2 years, 3 years has been, is it good? Has it been good for history? And is it good for you personally? Because it turns out that that's what our kids need to know. So I would say, and now when I talk to people, even my own kids, I want to know what's keeping you. Like,
Hmm.
where's your doubt? It's okay to express your doubt. Let's
Sure.
let's let's entertain it together. I may not be able to satisfactorily answer your doubt, but I know there's an answer.
Hmm.
So what is keep? So that's the first question I have for anyone. It's not a pitch of the gospel. It's like, hey, I'm sure you've heard of Christianity, or does God exist? What is keeping you from thinking that it might be true? let's cross those first, because you're not going to hear the gospel from me if you still have walls that you've constructed. So by the time the gospel gets through the walls, it sounds like want, 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 want. We have to kind of knock those walls down first. But I
Yeah.
think we ought to do that with our kids, and we ought to be having a bunch of them. If we're in an environment that is no longer positive or neutral, but is actually negative, well, then we need to be raising up the next generation. And it's not somebody else's kids. Still the strongest determiner globally for what someone will believe as an adult is, what did their parents believe?
Well, thank you. Thank you for sticking around and answering questions, and thank you so much for just taking time out of your day to be with us for an hour or so. And we're really thankful for your writing and for the work that you do. And we want to wish you a nice December season and eventually a Merry Christmas, and good luck with your next writing projects and with the grandchildren.
Well, I appreciate you so much. I mean, it's my honor to be privileged enough to be in a position where you would even take a book and translate it. So I just want to thank you for that. And anytime you want to reach out to me, let's do it again. Okay?
All right, we'll do that.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks. All right. Bye, guys. Bye, everyone.